Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. In this video I'll talk about the process of developing the self, cultivating the self, or as Jung called it, the process of individuation. Now I'll particularly focus on sort of this headline, the development of the self versus individuation, because there's a lot of misunderstandings revolving around this sort of development of the self. And I want to sort of clear that up and come to the conclusion or propose to you that actually the development of the self is on the one hand a natural process that occurs anyways, and on the other hand it is a process that we cannot control. Now the video is split into a couple of components. I'll talk about sort of the natural component or the natural development of the self, so the natural process of individuation as it occurs naturally. I'll talk about the resistance of the ego against content within the content from the non-ego. To introduce that, I'll have to talk about the ego a little bit, and then we'll talk about sort of these attempts to, let's say, forcefully develop contents of the, forcefully bring contents of the non-ego into the ego, and ways out of sort of this forceful, this let's say false attempts to develop the self. Now, just as a brief note before we begin, if you do have any questions or if you do want other videos on these topics, then please do leave a comment below. And if you want further videos, then let me know. And also, if you are looking for a reading list, or if you're looking for recommended readings on Jung and beyond, then please do check out the description of this video, where you'll find a link to a document that I made with a sort of a reading list. You'll answer a couple questions, and then you get sort of an individual reading list that you can use for your further studies of Jung and beyond. Now, let's get going. Why? Let's maybe start perhaps with the question, sort of why the self, or what is the self, and why do we care to develop it? The self, as Jung proposed it, is the objective core of the psyche. Now, what this precisely means, I think, is that the self essentially comprises the whole of the psyche. And there's a lot to the psyche, more than you can fathom, in fact, because the psyche reaches down, as Jung proposed, into a collective realm, into sort of what he called the collective unconscious. Now, this collective unconscious is at the same time a macrocosmic space, so the space that underlies all of reality in the macrocosm, so in the reality out there, if you will, as it is a space in the microcosm, so sort of the fundament of the reality that we live with, that we inhabit. The self is sort of the, let's say, individual manifestation of this macrocosm. And what this means is not that there are certain elements that are sort of, let's say, absent within ourselves, but that there's the weights of these elements differ from person to person, and their composition that can be infinitely complex. Now, in any case, I imagine the psyche to have sort of to be comprised of nuclei, different nuclei that are spread in, space for the sake of the spatial metaphor. And these nuclei are what Jung called the archetypes. Now, they would be aspects of the collective unconscious, and they are sort of the cores around which contents of the everyday interaction with reality can cluster. These contents I refer to as elements. So elements can cluster around these nuclei to build sort of the psychic makeup that we then consider to be ourselves, to be us. Now, what this means is also that these elements have a fundamental influence on sort of the way that we conduct ourselves in reality, the way that we perceive reality, if we want to sort of dramatize it a little bit. And that is precisely the reason why Jung proposes it'll be a good idea to build a relationship with them. Now, this relationship is fundamental because when we're born in the beginning of life, we're encapsulated by these elements to a very large extent, or entirely, in fact. This is symbolically displayed in sort of the symbol of the Ouroboros, this sort of womb that is all-encompassing, that is the whole world in its original state. Now, the interesting component here is that basically the child physically is also encapsulated by the womb of the mother that it is born from. In this process, in the first weeks of life, the mother is literally still the child, essentially, for the psyche of the child. Now, what this means for example, Erich Neumann wrote an essay on sort of the phylogenetic development of the ego self axis, and he talks about sort of this the self literally being the mother in the first days of the child, which essentially simply to say the child is displaced, is externalized, if you will, in this mother figure that it is born from, because it is still one with it. Now, over time, the ego detaches from the self, which is the first part of individuation that I've talked about in other videos, first phase of individuation, and detaches from it. And this now is sort of the point where we have to talk about the ego, its function, and the problematic situation with the self and the ego connection. So the ego develops as, let's say, the subjective core of the psyche. And the subjective core of the psyche is precisely sort of the narrative, the story that we tell about ourselves to ourselves, and then in part also to others via the persona. Now, what this means is that these elements that are clustered around these nuclei that I referred to earlier are interpreted in a certain way by the ego. And this interpretation, this interpretive function of the ego, subjugates the complexity of these elements, not only in their reality, but also in their relation to each other, in relation to these nuclei that they're clustered around, and so on. Which means that the ego essentially is always involved in a process that I refer to as crystallization. The ego takes elements that have a certain reality for themselves, they continue to develop outside somewhere, and they have a reality for the psyche as a whole, and crystallizes them. That means makes them permanent. And this making them, rendering them permanent, is essentially problematic because the elements continue, as I said, to develop. Now, also these elements have a relationship to these nuclei, the archetypes, the trajectory, and the ego disregards this relationship entirely because it simply cannot grasp its this complexity. It doesn't see it. It thinks, the ego always thinks it's in control, it's in charge. Now, the whole idea then of the individuation process, or of the process of developing the self, is to sort of, let's say, make the ego realize that this throne that it sits on, this being in charge, is actually not the case, while at the same time maintaining a healthy relationship to the ego and building a relationship to the self, and so to this other within oneself. So by building this relationship to the self, you essentially build a relationship to the whole. That's why the idea of the process of individuation is an idea of gaining wholeness, becoming sort of one, becoming whole, becoming one with the whole. The idea here is that this process of individuation is essentially a natural process. Jung proposes that essentially the development of the ego towards the self is akin to the development of a tree that grows from a seed. And as you may imagine, this process doesn't require a lot of force, and you may ask the question, well then why do we have to concern ourselves with this anyways if this occurs in any case? And the answer to this question is that precisely this structure of the ego becomes stronger and stronger. The hubris of the ego becomes more and more pronounced because, and now this is important, because the ego isn't ruptured, as I would put it. We're more and more sort of detached on the one hand from what I would call negative judgment, that is the moments in which the ego is sort of told, well, you're wrong about your interpretation, please reconsider. And on the other hand, the ego becomes stronger and stronger, more and more pronounced over time within society. Now, this is problematic because the relationship to the self is therefore sort of inhibited, it's sort of cut off. For Jung, this happened as a historical phenomenon. So basically, over time, consciousness became stronger and stronger, enabling us or co-occurring with the development of a complex societal structures that also then again require the ego to become stronger and stronger. Because again, you want to learn and navigate these structures. And for that, you need an interpretive framework that, secures you in this navigation process, which then would be the ego. Now, Jung proposed that there was a shift, thus, from this natural process to sort of a projection on religious phenomena. So religions would act for a certain time as a vessel for the individuation process, for the development of a relationship to the self. And this worked well because religions essentially could take over certain roles, and the ego would be sort of, let's say, broken down or broken into these sort of collective phenomena that were going on in the religious context. The problem is that as religion lost its numinosity in a secular society, this didn't work anymore. Let's put it simple. So for this reason today, there's a lot of sort of development of artificial processes that attempt to sort of help the realization of the self. And that's what I sort of want to intervene with, right? That's the main sort of purpose of this video that we're developing towards. These artificial processes range from sort of meditations to therapeutic interventions and so on and so forth. The idea here is always that the ego, it needs to encounter that which it is not in order to be sort of dismembered into some extent, and then allow certain contents to become to influx into it in order to reconsider itself. Now, this obviously doesn't work if you're in a context where you're simply dealing with, let's say, yourself again, which is a context like social media, which are affirmative situations in which you're simply told that you're right. The ego always functions precisely the way social media functions. A thumbs up is always sort of given, right? And for the reason that a thumbs up is always given, the ego can simply go on projecting sort of its stability into the future, continuing to crystallize its elements. What the development of the ego, however, needs is the opposite. It needs rupture. It needs the sort of the encounter with something that threatens its stability, which is precisely why Jung says, well, look into the shadows and you'll find the truth. And this is of course referring also to the archetype of the shadow, that is precisely embodying these functions that you don't want to see. Now, the reason why I'm concerned sort of with these displays or modern sort of ideas of the development of the self or the process of individuation is because I think they are, to some extent, again, highlighting the idea that we can simply develop something of our own. Like, I don't think that's true, because essentially the non-ego, right, is precisely that which we can't develop on our own. It is that which is before us, which comes before us as, let's say, a reality the way it is. Now, what can we do then? And I think this is quite an interesting question to ask, and I guess this is what many people are concerned with. And I would respond with sort of two gestures that we can perform, and that is sort of the gesture of oneness and the gesture of witnessing. Now, witnessing and oneness, they both require a certain openness, because to consider yourself one with something else is already the first step to considering your ego to be limited. It also requires letting go of your own responsibility. Yes, you're responsible on certain levels, on a day-to-day level, which is quite fair and quite important, but precisely this process of development is a natural process, and you have to simply submit yourself, again, ask yourself, okay, what am I scared of? What am I afraid of? What situations am I going to go in? And then submit yourself to precisely that, and let the magic happen, let's say. And I think it's very important to sort of note in this context that letting something happen also means allowing an ego death to occur. Ego death would be precisely this sort of breakdown of the ego to some extent, because in the aftermath, the ego will sort of potentially be strengthened because it integrates, it expands. It expands the realm of light that it casts on the world. Witnessing in this context is precisely this gesture. You want to look, you want to see. And looking and seeing are two sort of very archetypal phenomena. I mean, if you look at Egyptian mythology, for example, seeing is a key idea of, let's say, success and enlightenment, right? Enlightenment is precisely the idea of seeing. And the idea here is essentially that you want to, once you're in the darkness, you want to keep your eyes open and see. You don't want to look away, because looking away is precisely the gesture the ego would make, because it does not want to see something that would potentially rupture its stability. So I think these two gestures are crucial if you want to go into, sort of delve into this process and move beyond the ego that you've constructed. Now, again, if you think this is interesting and you want to have a couple further notes on this, do let me know. Reach out to me. You'll find space for that in the comments, and I'm happy to make other videos on this content. And of course, do leave a like and a comment below. Thanks a lot for watching.